For a long moment it seemed I simply stood there. Time had no bearing upon me, nor upon those shifting vampires with their light, ethereal laughter filling my ears. I remember thinking that I wanted to put my hands over my ears, but I wouldn't let go of the dress, couldn't stop trying to make it so small that it was hidden within my hands. I remember a row of candles burning, an uneven row coming to light one by one against the painted walls. A door stood open to the rain, and all the candles spluttered and blew on the wind as if the flames were being lifted from the wicks. But they clung to the wicks and were all right. I knew that Claudia was through the doorway. The candles moved. The vampires had hold of them. Santiago had a candle and was bowing to me and gesturing for me to pass through the door. I was barely aware of him. I didn't care about him or the others at all. Something in me said, if you care about them, you will go mad. And they don't matter, really. She matters. Where is she? Find her. And their laughter was remote, and it seemed to have a color and shape, but to be part of nothing. Then I saw something through the open doorway, which was something I had seen before, a long, long time ago. No one knew of this thing I'd seen years before except myself. No, Lestat knew, but it didn't matter. He wouldn't know now or understand that he and I had seen this thing standing at the door of that brick kitchen in the Rue Royale, two wet, shriveled things that had been alive, mother and daughter in one another's arms. The murdered pair on the kitchen floor. But these two lying under the gentle rain were Madeline and Claudia, and Madeline's lovely red hair mingled with the gold of Claudia's hair, which stirred and glistened in the wind that sucked through the open doorway. Only that which was living had been burnt away, not the hair, not the long, empty velvet dress, not the small blood-stained chemise with the eyelets of white lace. And the blackened, burnt, and drawn thing that was Madeline still bore the stamp of her living face, and the hand that clutched at the child was whole like a mummy's hand. But the child, the ancient one, my Claudia, was ashes. A cry rose in me, a wild, consuming cry that came from the bowels of my being, rising up like the wind in that narrow place. The wind that swirled the rain teeming on those ashes, beating at the trace of a tiny hand against the bricks, that golden hair lifting, those loose strands rising, flying upwards. And a blow struck me even as I cried out, and I had hold of something that I believed to be Santiago, and I was pounding against him, destroying him, twisting that grinning white face around with hands from which he couldn't free himself, hands against which he railed, crying out, his cries mingled with my cries, his boots coming down into those ashes as I threw him backwards away from them, my own eyes blinded with the rain, with my tears, until he lay back away from me, and I was reaching out for him even as he held out his hand, and the one I was struggling against was Armand. Armand, who was forcing me out of the tiny graveyard into the whirling colors of the ballroom, the cries, the mingling voices, that searing, silver laughter. And Lestat was calling out, "Louis! Wait for me, Louis! I must talk to you!" I could see Armand's rich, brown eye close to mine, and I felt weak all over, and vaguely aware that Madeline and Claudia were dead. His voice saying softly, perhaps soundlessly, I could not prevent it. I could not prevent it. And they were dead. Simply dead. And I was losing consciousness. Santiago was near them somewhere. There they were still, that hair lifted on the wind, swept across the bricks, unraveling locks. But I was losing consciousness. I could not gather their bodies up with me, could not take them out. Armand had his arm around my back, his hand under my arm, and he was all but carrying me through some hollow wooden echoing place, and the smells of the street were rising, the fresh smell of the horses and the leather, and there were the gleaming carriages stopped there, and I could see myself clearly running down the Boulevard des Capucines with a small coffin under my arm, and the people making way for me, and dozens of people rising around the crowded tables of the open cafe, and a man lifting his arm. It seemed I stumbled then, the Louis who Armand held in his arm, and again I saw his brown eyes looking at me, and I felt that drowsiness, that sinking, and yet I walked, I moved, I saw the gleam of my own boots on the pavement. Is he mad that he says these things to me? I was asking of Lestat, my voice shrill and angry, even the sound of it giving me some comfort. I was laughing loudly. He's stark raving mad to speak of me in this manner. Did you hear him? I demanded. And Armand's eye said, sleep. I wanted to say something about Madeleine and Claudia, that we could not leave them there, and I felt that cry rising again inside me, that cry that pushed everything else out of its way. My teeth clenched to keep it in, because it was so loud and so full it would destroy me if I let it go. And then I conceived of everything too clearly. We were walking now, a belligerent, blind sort of walking that men do when they are wildly drunk and filled with hatred for others, while at the same time they feel invincible. I was walking in such a manner through New Orleans the night I'd first encountered Lestat, that drunken walking which is a battering against things, which is miraculously sure-footed and finds its path. I saw a drunken man's hands fumbling miraculously with a match. Flame touched the pipe, the smoke drawn in. I was standing at a cafe window. The man was drawing on his pipe. He was not at all drunk. Armand stood beside me waiting, and we were in the crowded Boulevard de Capucines, or Capucines, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. Or was it the Boulevard du Temple? I wasn't sure. I was outraged that their bodies remained there in that vile place. I saw Santiago's foot touching the blackened, burned thing that had been my child. I was crying out through clenched teeth, and the man had risen from his table, and steam spread out on the glass in front of his face. Get away from me, I was saying to Armand. Damn you into hell! Don't come near me! I warn you, don't come near me! I was walking away from him up the boulevard, and I could see a man and a woman stepping aside for me, the man with his arm out to protect the woman. Then I was running. People saw me running. I wondered how it appeared to them, what wild, white thing they saw that moved too fast for their eyes. I remember that by the time I stopped, I was weak and sick, and my veins were burning as if I were starved. I thought of killing, and the thought filled me with revulsion. I was sitting on the stone steps beside the church, at one of those small side doors carved into the stone, which was bolted and locked for the night. The rain had abated, or so it seemed, and the street was dreary and quiet, though a man passed a long way off with a bright black umbrella. Armand stood at a distance under the trees. Behind him it seemed there was a great expanse of trees and wet grasses and mist rising as if the ground were warm. By thinking of only one thing, the sickness in my stomach and head and the tightening in my throat, was I able to return to a state of calm. By the time these things had died away and I was feeling clear again, I was aware of all that had happened. The great distance we'd come from the theatre, and that the remains of Madeleine and Claudia were still there, victims of a holocaust in each other's arms. And I felt resolute and very near to my own destruction. I could not prevent it, Armand said softly to me, and I looked up to see his face unutterably sad. He looked away from me as if he felt it was futile to try and convince me of this, and I could feel his overwhelming sadness, his near defeat. I had the feeling that if I were to vent all my anger on him, he would do little to resist me. And I could feel that detachment, that passivity in him as something pervasive, which was the root of what he insisted to me again. I could not have prevented it. "Oh, but you could have prevented it," I said softly. "You knew full well you could have. You were the leader. You were the one who knew the limits of your own power. They didn't know. They didn't understand. Your understanding surpassed theirs." He looked away still, but I could see the effect of my words on him. I could see the weariness in his face, the dull, lusterless sadness of his eyes. "You held sway over them. They feared you," I went on. "You could have stopped them if you'd been willing to use that power even beyond your own self-prescribed limits. It was your sense of yourself that you would not violate, your own precious conception of truth. I understand you perfectly. I see in you the reflection of myself." His voice moved gently to engage mine, but he said nothing. The pain of his face was terrible. It was softened and desperate with pain and on the verge of some terrible, explicit emotion he would not be able to control. He was in fear of that emotion. I was not. He was feeling my pain with that great spellbinding power of his, which surpassed mine. I was not feeling his pain. It did not matter to me. "I understand you only too well," I said. "That passivity in me has been the core of it all, the real evil. That weakness, that refusal to compromise a fractured and stupid morality, that awful pride. For that, I let myself become the thing I am, when I knew it was wrong. For that, I let Claudia become the vampire she became, when I knew it was wrong. For that, I stood by and let her kill Lestat, when I knew that was wrong, the very thing that was her undoing. I lifted not a finger to prevent it. And Madeline, I let her come to that, when I should never have made her a creature like ourselves. I knew that was wrong. Well, I tell you, I am no longer that passive, weak creature that has spun evil from evil till the web is vast and thick, while I remain its stultified victim. It's over. I know what I must do, and I warn you, for whatever mercy you've shown me in digging me out of that grave tonight where I would have died, do not seek your cell in the Theatre des Vampires again. Do not go near it." I didn't wait to hear the answer. Perhaps he never attempted one. I don't know. I left him without looking back. If he followed me, I was not conscious of it. I did not seek to know. I did not care. It was to the cemetery in Montmartre that I retreated. Why that place, I'm not certain, except that it wasn't far from the Boulevard des Capucines, I suppose. Sorry, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of these place names. And Montmartre, or Montmartre, was countrified then, and dark and peaceful compared to the metropolis, wandering among the low houses with their kitchen gardens. I killed without the slightest measure of satisfaction, and then sought out the coffin where I was to lie by day in the cemetery. I scraped the remains out of it with my bare hands and lay down to a bed of foulness, of damp, of the stench of death. I cannot say this gave me comfort, rather it gave me what I wanted. Closeted in that dark, smelling the earth, away from all humans and all living human forms, I gave myself over to everything that invaded and stifled my senses. And in doing, I gave myself over to my grief. But that was short. When the cold, grey winter sun had set the next night, I was awake, feeling the tingling numbness leave me soon, as it does in winter, feeling the dark, living things that inhabited the coffin scurrying around me, fleeing my resurrection. I emerged slowly under the faint moon, savouring the coldness, the utter smoothness of the marble slab I shifted to escape. And wandering out of the graves and out of the cemetery, I went over a plan in my mind, a plan on which I was willing to gamble my life with the powerful freedom of being of a plan on which I was willing to gamble my life with the powerful freedom of a being who truly does not care for that life, who has the extraordinary strength of being willing to die. In a kitchen garden I saw something that had only been vague in my thoughts until I had my hands on it. It was a small scythe, its sharp, curved blade still caked with green weeds from the last mowing, and once I'd wiped it clean and run my fingers along the sharp blade, it was as if my plan came clear to me and I could move fast to my other errands, the getting of a carriage and a driver who could do my bidding for days, dazzled by the cash I gave him and the promises of more, the removing of my chest from the Hotel St. Gabriel to the inside of that carriage, and the procuring of all the other things which I needed. And then there were the long hours of the night, when I could pretend to drink with my driver and talk with him, and obtain his expensive cooperation in driving me at dawn from Paris to Fontainebleau. I slept within the carriage, where my delicate health required I not be disturbed under any circumstances, this privacy being so important that I was more than willing to add a generous sum to the amount I was already paying him, simply for his not touching even the door-handle of the carriage until I emerged from it. And when I was convinced he was in agreement, and quite drunk enough to be oblivious to almost everything but the gathering of the reins for the journey to Fontainebleau, we drove slowly, cautiously onto the street of the Theatre des Vampires, and waited some distance away for the sky to begin to grow light. The theatre was shut up and locked against the coming day. I crept towards it when the air and the light told me I had at most 15 minutes to execute my plan. I knew that closeted far within, the vampires of the theatre were in their coffins already, and that even if one late vampire lingered on the verge of going to bed, he would not hear these first preparations. Quickly I put pieces of wood against the bolted doors. Quickly I drove in the nails which then locked these doors from the outside. A passer-by took some note of what I did, but went on, believing me perhaps to be boarding up the establishment with the authority of the owner. I didn't know. I did know, however, that before I was finished I might encounter those ticket sellers, those ushers, those men who swept up after, and might well remain inside to guard the vampires in their daily sleep. It was one of those men I was thinking as I led the carriage up to Armand's alley and left it there, taking with me 2 small barrels of kerosene. It was of those men, sorry, I got confused there. It was of those men I was thinking as I led the carriage up to Armand's alley and left it there, taking with me 2 small barrels of kerosene to Armand's door. The key admitted me easily, as I'd hoped, and once inside the lower passage I opened the door of his cell to find he was not there. The coffin was gone. In fact, everything was gone but the furnishings, including the dead boy's enclosed bed. Hastily I opened one barrel, and, rolling the other before me towards the stairs, I hurried along, splashing the exposed beams with kerosene and flinging it on the wooden doors of the other cells. The smell of it was strong, stronger and more powerful than any sound I might have made to alert anyone. And though I stood stark still in the stairs with the barrels and the scythe, listening, I heard nothing of those guards I presumed to be there, nothing of the vampires themselves, and clutching the handle of the scythe I ventured slowly upwards until I stood in the door of the ballroom. No one was there to see me splash the kerosene on the horsehair chairs or on the draperies, or to see me hesitate just for an instant at the doorway of the small yard where Madeleine and Claudia had been killed. Oh, how I wanted to open that door. It so tempted me for a minute I almost forgot my plan. I almost dropped the barrels and turned the knob, but I could see the light through the cracks of the old wood of the door, and I knew I had to go on. Madeleine and Claudia were not there. They were dead. And what would I have done had I opened that doorway? Had I been confronted again with those remains, that matted, dishevelled golden hair? There was no time, no purpose. I was running through dark corridors I hadn't explored before, bathing old wooden doors with the kerosene, certain that the vampires lay closeted within, rushing on cat feet into the theatre itself, where a cold grey light seeping from the bolted front entrance sped me on to fling a dark stain across the great velvet stage curtain, the padded chairs, the draperies of the lobby doors. And finally the barrel was empty and thrown away, and I was pulling on the crude torch I'd made, putting my match to its kerosene-drenched rags, and setting the chairs alight, the flames licking their thick silken padding as I ran towards the stage and sent the fire rushing up that dark curtain into a cold, sucking draught. In seconds the theatre blazed, as with the light of day, and the whole frame of it seemed to creak and groan as the fire roared up the walls, licking the great proscenium arch, the plaster curlicues of the overhanging boxes. But I had no time to admire it, to savour the smell and the sound of it, the sight of the nooks and crannies coming to light in the fierce illumination that would soon consume them. I was fleeing to the lower floor again, thrusting the torch into the horsehair couch of the ballroom, into the curtains, into anything that would burn. Someone thundered on the boards above, in rooms I'd never seen, but then I heard the unmistakable opening of a door. But it was too late, I told myself, gripping both the scythe and the torch. The building was alight. They would be destroyed. I ran for the stairs, a distant cry rising over the crackling and roaring of the flames, my torch scraping the kerosene-soaked rafters above me, the flames enveloping the old wood, curling against the damp ceiling. It was Santiago's cry. I was sure of it. And then, as I hit the lower floor, I saw him above, behind me, coming down the stairs, the smoke filling the stairwell around him, his eyes watering, his throat thickened with his choking, his hand out towards me as he stammered, You, damn you! And I froze, narrowing my eyes against the smoke, feeling the water rising in them, burning in them, but never letting go of his image for an instant. The vampire using all his power now to fly at me with such speed he would become invisible. And as the dark thing that was his clothes rushed down, I swung the scythe and saw it strike his neck, and felt the weight of his neck, and saw him fall sideways, both hands reaching for the appalling wound. The air was full of cries, of screams, and a white face loomed above Santiago, a mask of terror. Some other vampire ran through the passage ahead of me towards that secret alleyway door, but I stood there poised, staring at Santiago, seeing him rise despite the wound. And I swung the scythe again, catching him easily. And there was no wound, just two hands groping for a head that was no longer there. And the head, blood coursing from the torn neck, the eyes staring wild under the flaming rafters, the dark, silky hair matted and wet with blood, fell at my feet. I struck it hard with my boot. I sent it flying across the passage, and I ran after it, the torch and the scythe thrown aside as my arms went up to protect me from the blaze of white light that flooded the stairs of the alley. The rain descended in shimmering needles into my eyes that squinted to see the dark outline of the carriage flicker against the sky. The slumped driver straightened at my hoarse command, his clumsy hand going instinctively for the whip, and the carriage lurched as I pulled open the door, the horses driving forward as fast as I grappled with the lid of my chest, my body thrown roughly to one side, my burnt hands slipping down into the cold, protecting silk, the lid coming down into concealing darkness. The pace of the horses increased, driving away from the corner of the burning building. Yet I could still smell the smoke. It choked me. It burnt my eyes and my lungs, even as my hands were burnt and my forehead was burnt from the first diffused light of the sun. But we were driving on, away from the smoke and the cries. We were leaving Paris. I had done it. The Theatre des Vampires was burning to the ground. And I felt my head fall back. I saw Claudia and Madeleine again in one another's arms in that grim yard. And I said to them softly, bending down to the soft heads of hair that glistened in the candlelight, I couldn't take you away. I couldn't take you. But they will lie ruined and dead all around you. If the fire doesn't consume them, it will be the sun. If they are not burnt out, then it will be the people who will come to fight the fire, who will find them and expose them to the light of day. But I promise you, they will all die as you have died. Everyone who was closeted there this dawn will die. And they are the only deaths I have caused in my long life, which are both exquisite and good. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, that is another section of Interview with the Vampire. What happened today? Well, first thing I have noted down here is an observation that I realized today that relates back to yesterday's reading, but is still immediately pertinent to the story. And that is the symbolic significance of Louis being locked in the coffin as part of his punishment, essentially. And I think it is somewhat thematically significant here that in being forced into the coffin and locked in there and buried alive, essentially, Louis is forced to experience the same suffering that the woman was forced to feel at the hands of Lestat earlier in the text. Again, this kind of just consistent theme of mirroring and the actions of other characters or the things that other characters suffer or do being reflected back on Louis later in the book. There's definitely something in that requires a more in-depth reading, but I just thought I'd bring it up because I think it's an interesting observation to consider. But on to the stuff that relates to today. Obviously, we know that Claudia and Madeleine have been killed at this stage, and they have been killed through exposure to sunlight, confirming to us something that we didn't actually know explicitly beforehand, that vampires will actually die if exposed to sunlight, because we've had vampires tell us that vampires die when exposed to sunlight, but we've never seen it happen. Now we actually see it happen, and we see that it's true. And in seeing the remains of their bodies, it's the moment that finally sets Louis off, after so many other moments of us thinking Louis is about to finally be set off. He actually acknowledges that all his nihilistic procrastination was harmful. And he absolutely tears into Armand for 2 pages, and it's amazing. He recognizes that he actually possesses moral responsibility. He keeps saying this line over and over again. I knew it was wrong. I knew that was wrong, but I still did it. I still allowed it to happen. And he realizes that's a bad thing. He recognizes very explicitly that this notion of passivity and detachment are the core of his real evil. His notion of being unwilling to act against anyone doing evil, this notion of just going along with evil because it's easy. He recognizes that as evil and bad. Louis, well done, you finally figured something out. For fuck's sake, it's taken you 300 pages, but you've done it. And then he immediately goes and kills someone. Immediately. Because what Louis has actually figured out here is not a resolution to behave differently. He still believes it's impossible for him to behave differently. He still believes he's trapped by this vampire nature, this gaslighting Stockholm syndrome that's been beaten into him by Lestat and Armand and Claudia. He realizes that evil is a thing, even if nothing means anything. And he wants to stop evil being done by other people. But he doesn't go far enough to the point of actually realizing in himself that it's not just enough to stop other people doing evil. You have to stop it yourself too. He acknowledges the degree to which Armand's views reflect on his own. Again, back to that mirroring that recurs. And he acknowledges that that's a bad thing. He sees in Armand everything that's bad about himself. And if there's something good coming out of this for Louis, it appears to be the case that he's attained some degree of personal independence. But it's still all based around this deluded obsession with Claudia. He doesn't come to this great moral realization because of, a sudden realization that those things are actually wrong. He comes to it through a notion of revenge, effectively. And it's not that it even inspires it, it is the sole basis for it. He explicitly says to himself that he's doing what he's doing for Claudia, which almost goes against the moral realization he seems to have just come to. So you can't feel too happy for him here. But he's made an important realization. It's just as usual with Louis. He makes these realizations and then never properly puts them into practice. He always misses the point of what he realizes, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here. He's still evil, and he's happy to be evil, and he wants to go about being evil. He just wants to stop other people from being evil too. He lives still in this state of conflict where he doesn't actually know what to do, but he is completely right to rip into Armand. Armand not only doesn't doesn't do anything to stop the destruction of Claudia, it's pretty explicitly implied that he basically enables it, from the fact that he talks about, if Claudia weren't alive, you'd be free, wouldn't you? That kind of thing. His obsession is so great that he just is really happy to get rid of all competition. He makes zero effort to rescue Claudia. None at all. He's only trying to rescue Louis. When Louis fully says, you're stronger than them, you could have rescued her. You chose not to. Again, this thing of Louis realizing that you can choose. You can choose to do the right thing. It's just a shame he doesn't choose to do the right thing. And Armand does this thing where he refuses to rescue Claudia immediately after he made this promise to not interfere with Louis and Claudia. So at worst, he's killing Claudia through explicit order and action, and at best he's killing Claudia through his own willful inaction. Both are bad. Not bad because they're monsters, but you get what I mean here. They're both... He's lying. Armand is a pathetic liar, just like Lestat. And whenever Louis is calling him out on his bullshit, he just gets really, really sad and upset, and he tries to, pretend he had no choice. He does that thing Louis did before, where he's like, I had no choice. I had to do it. Now Armand's saying that he had no choice, and Louis realizes that's dumb. Louis realizes you do have a choice. It's just a shame that Louis then goes, so I'm going to choose to do the wrong thing, but I'm also going to choose to do the right thing. I'm a vampire, something, vampire nature, It's muddy. I really don't get how Louis is putting these realizations together in his head, because it feels like he comes to realizations a lot in this book and then does exactly the opposite of what he's realized. And perhaps I'm just massively misreading them. Perhaps I'm missing important details. But that's the impression I come away with when I'm reading some of these grand revelations Louis comes to. It feels like he makes these really important statements and then just ignores them and acts like he's changed. But he has changed to a degree here. He just hasn't changed in the right way, I guess. I guess that's my main annoyance here with him. Yeah. Louis, his final action concluding this. Oh, I also should note that Louis gives Armand the opportunity to escape, which is framed in regards to being like a thank you for rescuing me. But considering what Louis just said about like Armand not like lying to him in regards to not being able to save Claudia, I feel like it's more of an indication of him not being completely out of Lestat's control and not really being willing to accept Armand doing anything wrong. He still has trouble with that, I think, to a degree. Louis then goes on to burn down the Theatre des Vampires. He burns down another thing. Louis loves burning things down. Which is interesting because when Claudia and Madeline burnt down the doll shop, Claudia remarked that fire purifies, and Louis responded by saying that fire doesn't purify, fire simply destroys. Yet, when Louis is burning things down, there seems to be this consistent theme of purification for him in those burnings. There's certainly a symbolic intent or implication to everything he burns down. When he burns down his plantation, he's burning down his old life, effectively. When he burns down the townhouse in New Orleans, he's burning down his like relationship with Lestat and escaping. And now when he burns down the theater, he's burning everything that it represents. So there does appear to be like a purification in Louis' burnings that goes against his prior belief, his statement of thinking that fire simply destroys. But I suppose it's also like fair enough to say that destroying, like referring to fire as destructive, has symbolic meaning too, and it's very fitting, I guess, with the hypocrisy of Louis that he is using this destructive bad force in this symbolic manner because he believes himself to be the one truly worthy of holding it, and he believes that he can do good through doing bad, and that he has to do bad, but he can do good through it, even though he doesn't have to do bad, and he can just do good, because, again, he is an independent moral actor, and there is no outside force making him do bad things. I cannot reiterate that enough, and you're probably sick of hearing it at this stage. But anyway, that is another little section of Interview with the Vampire. I hope you enjoyed it. We're really near to finish, so I hope you'll tune in tomorrow for another bit. I'll see you then.